Good afternoon, board members. It's Ben Rarick here with Sarah Rich. We're going to, today's webinar is about reviewing the input of the Achievement and Accountability Work Group. Purpose of this webinar is really to prepare you for the January board meeting. And the January board meeting is a key meeting for us in the construction of the index that we're going to submit to the federal government. Recall that at the last board meeting we made some initial key decisions about the design of the index. January brings forth 4 new key questions that we need to resolve to stay on the course of the development of the index. And the terminology that we're using is that at the completion of the January meeting, we will have made enough key kind of architectural decisions to have an index prototype. And that index prototype will give your staff the go-ahead to start the construction of the index in earnest, actually working with the consultants on the technical specifications of the model itself. You'll see here the timeline reiterates that. We hope to begin actually building the index after your decisions in January through February and March. In March, we're going to start talking about not necessarily how to build the index, but how to use the index for the purposes of identifying priority focus in emerging schools, in terms of how it relates to the required action process, and in terms of how it establishes AMOs, annual measurable objectives. So that's the timeline. We hope that you'll use this webinar to develop your set of questions so that you have them well in advance, you have the information you need well in advance, and you can reach out either to Sarah or myself in preparation for your decision points in January. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Ben. So this slide shows you essentially a framework of the 3 major performance indicators as defined by you. The first is proficiency, which is the % of students meeting standard on state tests, and including a gap measure by subgroup. The second is student growth percentiles, so that's looking at growth for all students and growth by subgroups, again with that focus on opportunity gaps. And the third is career and college readiness, which includes graduation rates, and will also include additional career and college readiness indicators, which are going to be the focus of one of the questions presented here. You asked the AAW 3 major questions, and then we revisited a question from the first meeting. So you asked them to discuss what specific sub-indicators should be included to measure career and college readiness beyond graduation rates, and if any of them should be reported but not used for a calculation of an index score. Secondly, you asked them to look at whether or not the index should include English language acquisition data, and whether or not it should include a new subgroup of former English language learners. Subgroups revisited, this refers to some additional analysis needed by the AAW about the best way to address subgroups in order to ensure that as many students are counted as possible and gaps are visible. And finally, a new question for them about targets and asking which indicators should have norm reference targets or which should have criterion reference targets. We'll turn first to college and career, or career and college readiness options. We posed several options here to them with a 4th option that they could define. They run from least complex to more. We really tried to show just a range of options so that they had something to respond to. This does not limit the options that they could have listed. So I'll walk you through this chart. The first row reflects graduation rates. So 4-year graduation rates are required by the ESEA flexibility and required for reporting to the Department of Education. 5-year graduation rates were committed to in Washington's ESEA flexibility request, and that reflects current practice in our index. Another option would be giving high schools credit for 6- or 7-year graduation rates, as some stakeholders have requested of you. The next row refers to the % of students demonstrating career and college readiness on the Common Core assessments in the 11th grade, also known as SBAC. That's required to be included, so it runs across all these options. The third row is the % of students earning credit in dual credit courses. So this would include advanced placement, tech prep, running start, college in the high school, and others. It really reflects the intent behind the launch year legislation that directed high schools to give students opportunity to earn post-secondary credit toward a certificate, apprenticeship, technical degree, or 2- or 4-year degrees. So multiple pathways for students. This option C here adds industry certification to dual credit. There is some overlap, but not complete overlap between those two categories, and as staff, we're still exploring that. The fourth row here is remediation rates in post-secondary programs, which was discussed at length at the last board meeting. And the fifth row is 7th and 8th grade dropout rates. High school dropout rates are already very directly correlated to graduation rates. The students who drop out before they reach the 9th grade are not reflected in current graduation or high school dropout rates. So we are posing this to them as a middle school option for career and college readiness opportunities. There were other options that were discussed and available, but we provided these 3 options as a starting point so AAW members had something to reflect upon. And again, option D was their opportunity to define their own set of indicators. There was general agreement among the AAW members that the index should include the Common Core assessment at the career and college level and the percent of students who earn high school credit and dual credit courses or receive industry certification. Graduation rates spurred a robust discussion about whether or not they should include rates beyond 5 years. And there was very strong consensus that post-high school remediation rates should not be included as accountability measures for schools. AAW members pointed out the lack of alignment, system alignment between high schools and higher ed, and they were concerned about the redundancy of measuring both the percent of students passing a career and college ready assessment at the 11th grade and also counting students who needed remediation once they reached post-high school coursework. A couple of other additional questions and considerations were whether or not to include college enrollment or college completion or students who leave high school to secure a family, graduate from high school and then go on to secure a family wage job, but there wasn't widespread agreement about those indicators. There also was discussion about the ACT work keys, which is a work readiness assessment, but members acknowledged that it's not used uniformly around the state and there are associated costs that are practical constraints. So strengthening accountability for English language learners was an additional question. We've discussed at length some of the accountability challenges in our system. And so we asked the AAW kind of a high-level policy question without getting into details, whether or not English language acquisition, which is currently the Washington English Language Proficiency Assessment, should be incorporated in the index, and whether or not a new subgroup should be created, which would be a former English language learner subgroup in order to continue to highlight accountability for those students after they exit ELL status. The AAW unanimously supported the idea of including English language acquisition for English language learners, but acknowledged that there could be a lot of complexities that are generated as a result, and there are unanswered questions about how to best measure growth, whether that's progress on an English language proficiency test or acquisition of, student growth percentiles or concept of adequate progress. There's also possibility that our federal Title III ELL accountability measures may need to be revisited in order to avoid conflicts between our state achievement index and the federal system. There was also a question raised about whether or not the current English language assessment, the WELPA, is valid and should be used for this purposes. And the AAW did generally support the idea of including former ELLs either as a standalone subgroup or continuing to include them in the current ELL subgroup. OSPI already adds former ELLs to the ELL subgroup for 2 years after the students have reached English proficiency. So there was some discussion about extending that timeline in order to stabilize the subgroup population. So turning to subgroup options, at a school level, if students in a subgroup don't number at least 20, then for the sake of accountability, the subgroup performance isn't included in an index. And the result is that there are often hidden gaps among subgroups, pockets of kids who may be at risk for low performance, but we don't know it because there aren't enough of them to make their data visible. So we discussed several possible options here. The first option is not to address the question and to continue with the current system and the current federal subgroups. The benefit to that is simplicity, and districts are in the habit of doing this, so the implementation is easier. Option B was to add 2 new subgroups, as we've already discussed, former ELL, and in that same vein, former special ed. The idea here is to continue to monitor those students as discrete subgroups even after they exit ELL or special ed status. The third option, option C, is to create what we're calling super overall, which combines subgroups into 1 or 2 groups of students. And that would happen regardless of the number of students in a subgroup. And a number of states have taken this approach. The reasoning is that it simplifies the system and reduces duplication that currently happens because students are only in one subgroup. The problem with that approach is that it can blur important differences among subgroups and really goes in the opposite direction of transparency. D and E options here are similar. They're both super subgroup as needed options, meaning they'd really only be employed if there are fewer than 20 students in a subgroup, and combining them with another subgroup where there are fewer than 20 would make those student groups visible. D combines only for race and ethnicity. E combines race, ethnicity, low income, English language, learner status, and special ed status. And then F is actually looking at greater disaggregation than the current 11 federal subgroups, more nuanced data that would differentiate more clearly different subgroups, but also would result in greater subgroup suppression, because there would be lower n size. So we had somewhat mixed input on this discussion. There are a lot of trade-offs, whatever direction you go here, although generally speaking, AAW members liked options A through D best. The group discussed at length the distinction between reporting disaggregated data, just reporting it and making it transparent, and then actually using that disaggregated data for accountability purposes, and the trade-offs associated with each approach. Several AAW members who initially advocated for finer disaggregation ultimately expressed a preference to use the federal subgroup option as long as there can be more data reported and more readily available. Several AAW members preferred to use super subgroups combining race and ethnic subgroups on an as-needed basis. That would be D here. Although this would involve more students for accountability purposes, AAW members acknowledged this would create significant additional complexity. So turning toward targets, our final question, the current index system is primarily criterion referenced. For proficiency, it basically says something like, if 90% of our students meet standard on the math assessment, we get a 7 or the highest possible rating. But some states are looking at a system that rewards schools that perform above average. So they're able to say something like, only 65% of our students met standard, but this is well above the state average, so we got a high rating. So we discussed each of the performance indicators and whether or not criterion or norm reference might be an appropriate fit, and focused in particularly on growth and other indicators of career and college readiness for this conversation, since those are the 2 additions to the index. So the current index, all of the AAW members really wanted the index to focus on criterion reference performance targets when that was feasible. So they did acknowledge that switching to Common Core and new assessments may cause schools' performance to appear to drop, and this caused AAW members to support the idea of using a norm reference performance target for a transition period. And they agreed most targets really should be criterion referenced, but in a time of transition, norm referenced might be helpful. They also discussed the option of using criterion reference but reporting a school's relative rank for context. So if every school in the state is doing poorly in math, that doesn't mean that anyone would get a 7 necessarily, but if lots of schools are getting 4s, that there might be context there, that they're in the 90th percentile. So that helps schools communicate with their communities. The other consideration was that the index would only use criterion reference performance targets when there's really a clear standard to tie it to. So for dual credit, for example, if that were to be included, how would we set a target for that? So looking at below average performance, at average performance, or above average might be a better approach because there is no clear state policy goal or target set. So in summary, career and college readiness indicators had pretty mixed feedback. In addition to graduation rate, most AAW members supported the idea of using the Career and College Ready cut score on the SBAC and earning credit in dual enrollment coursework. Subgroup feedback was more mixed, and in the end, AAW members tended to land on using federal subgroups, but wanted some exploration of former ELL and former special ed. The English language learner feedback was quite strong that English language acquisition data should be included in the index. And for performance targets, it was much more mixed. Most wanted targets to be both norm and criterion referenced with a focus on criterion reference. I'm going to turn it back over to Ben.
And so the next steps, board members, are first that the AAW meeting happened literally days ago, so they are now in the process of reviewing the feedback report, submitting any changes. We'll let you know if any of the summary that we've provided here changes at all as a result of that process. We will also be issuing staff recommendations here shortly. We're providing you this webinar in advance given the holiday schedule and given the fact that the board packet is only, I believe, a week away. You will receive those staff recommendations with your January board packet. And finally, probably the most important outcome of this webinar for us will be that you submit your questions that you need answered so that you feel comfortable with the decisions that we need you to make in January to keep this process going. That is essentially the ultimate goal of today's webinar. We thank you for your attention and time.